So, traditional Jewish, Christian, and Muslim.
Atheist and agnostic.
I don't even know if I remember how to do this, Preston.
Our audience doesn't know how long it's been since we've last recorded.
How long it's been and how close we're pushing it to the deadline.
Right.
But yeah, it's been a minute since we've sat down together to host the Holy Watermelon Podcast. But yeah, we're back with a new kind of multi-episode topic.
Yeah, this one's a little bit more serious than the theme of February.
Yeah, February was really sexy.
Yeah, it was. What a sexy month.
Not really. Not where we are, but maybe warmer parts of the world, it's a sexy month.
Maybe.
I just wear a parka.
But February is that time where we celebrate the sexiness.
Fair.
Maybe to offset the depression of the winter and definitely, to keep warm.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so today we are talking about Islam, and our next episode we're talking about Islam. We're talking about two different parts.
Aspects
of Islam. So let's jump right in, I guess.
All right. Well, we've talked about Islam before.
Long time ago.
We talked mostly about Muhammad, the Quran, the Hadiths, things like that. Didn't really talk about the history and the splits and everything after that in as much detail as we're going to do today.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Sunni versus Shia Muslims. That's sort of the big divide. And I went a little bit theologically, but it's mostly a historical divide.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's mostly, I like this guy, and it sucks that you guys don't.
An early presidential race.
Sure.
So Islam is a relatively new religion compared to
the other popular
Abrahamic counterparts or even the Eastern religions.
Yeah.
It was developed in the 17th century CE in the Middle East. The founder, as Preston mentioned, is Muhammad, and he had revelations from God, which are now documented in the Muslim holy book of the Quran. Muhammad,
the Quran, eh?
Quran.
Not the Quran?
Quran. Am I just putting my emphasis wrong? We'll ask.
Maybe.
We'll ask Dr.
Depends who you ask.
We'll ask Dr. West next week.
There you go. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Alluding, foreshadowing. Muhammad, however, was really bad at succession planning.
That depends who you ask. There are people who insist that he had things set up. The majority disagree.
I would disagree. So he had amassed quite a following by his death in 632 CE, but he didn't tell anyone what he wanted to do with his recitation after he passed and this Muslim community he had built. So
and he didn't have any sons.
Which back in that day, even to this day, still there's some obviously first male heir or only male heir is the thing. So
yeah, it feels weird, but I mean that's a thing that happens. Lots of men just don't make sons.
I mean, yeah, Henry VIII had a hell of a time,
right?
I mean, and then he died.
Mm-hmm.
So
his Y chromosome was deficient.
Yep.
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know how that works. They didn't either because he kept killing his wives for it.
Yeah. I mean, not all of them. Just
most of them.
A couple.
So to put this into context before we get to where the split is Muhammad had actually done something quite remarkable at this time in history. Arabia was very tribal. You lived with your family units, and he had essentially broken those boundaries and created the Ummah, or the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, which is different than the Nation of Islam that is a existing thing today.
Yeah, just it's the umbrella term.
They were a nation, an Islamic nation, but the Ummah is definitely different from what is popularly known today as the Nation of Islam.
This Muslim Fellowship is probably the name of another group, but this group of Muslims, the Ummah, not having the succession plan, which I mean has since mostly sorted itself out, was really quite devastating at his death.
Yeah. I mean, to say it sorted itself out feels a little weird, but Yeah.
I mean, they got there eventually.
There's
two
a
groups.
solution.
They're not still fighting over it for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, it's a little more complicated than two groups. We've got two big umbrellas under which many groups huddle.
That was the point I added at the end of the document. Is I don't want this to be an oversimplification, but it is the two major groups of Islam.
So here's where we get the split. Some believed that the caliph, which is the term for the successor to Muhammad, what was the word that Reza Aslan used? It's like a deputy almost.
Yeah, like you look, and people will be familiar with the term caliphate. Which now, because of ISIS and the Taliban, have negative connotations. But it's the king in a kingdom, a caliph in a caliphate.
Yeah. So the idea was that this caliph would be somebody who should be properly qualified, someone who is close to Muhammad, understood and witnessed his teachings, and then as generations went on, the next closest thing as possible as time made it difficult to get the closest thing. And then there were others who believed that it should be more of an inherited thing through the closest possible relative to Muhammad. And so bloodline super important there, no matter whether they were any good.
Whether you understood his teachings or not, you were related to him. So
yeah.
I mean, that is an interesting debate on is divinity genetic? And I guess that's part of this.
That's part of the deal.
This conversation, yeah.
Yeah. So generally speaking, the Sunni Muslims were interested in those qualified leaders, and they make up the majority. About 85%, depending on where you get your statistics. Sometimes that number might be as low as 80. It's very obviously the vast majority of Muslims.
This is a global majority.
Yeah.
There are Shia Muslim countries, obviously.
Yeah. Density varies, of course, from country to country. There are a handful of countries that have a Shia majority. And of course, the Shiites are the ones who are interested in that inheritance tradition. And they have more clear-cut sectarianism than the Sunnis have.
That's interesting. I didn't look into it. Now that we're talking, I'm thinking about it, is the record keeping of Muhammad and all of his descendants to whoever they look at as the leader now. Would be quite interesting.
Yeah. Literacy is an interesting aspect of that too. That the Quran wasn't written down right away. It was written down a little later on, and the hadiths even a little later by the sounds of it.
Right. Yeah. And I think next episode we'll hear a lot about that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Muhammad's father-in-law, father of the infamously young Aisha, was elected the first caliph in 632 and then only died 2 years later.
His name was Abu Bakr.
Yes. And super important guy. He is respected by both Sunni and Shia Muslims. And in fact, the next couple people who follow after him also are accepted by both groups. And then things get hairy.
And then things get messier.
The name Sunni comes from the term sunnah, or the way or the tradition. Generally, it's just a handy catch-all word.
It is quite a broad term.
Yeah.
It basically is used to identify the Sunnis as the Orthodox group, as though a bunch of subcategories and internal deviations didn't rapidly become evident.
Yeah. As soon as Abu Bakr was selected by the majority of the Council of Old Companions of Muhammad, there were a handful of small groups who jumped at the opportunity for independence. And Abu Bakr smashed all of these rebellions pretty effectively. Well, not all of them, most of them very effectively. And declared that all Muslims belonged to the single community, that Ummah that we had mentioned before, that relied on interconnectivity of religion and state. One of those things that we have some serious issues with today.
Right.
Yeah, the idea of religious disestablishment was a novelty 1,000 years after this time. Connecting religion and government was extremely normal.
Yeah, man, what was I reading the other day? It wasn't even about Islam, but basically saying that this idea of the separation of church and state is so new that no one would have even considered it.
Yeah.
Now I want to know what religion they were talking about. What was I listening to? Oh, I was reading a book about Jesus, but they were talking about the Roman Empire and the Roman pantheon, and
Sure.
separating church and state wasn't even a concept. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Mostly, I just needed to go
Perfect.
through my brain files and be okay with that.
Yeah. So some of the Ummah really wanted a closer relative of the Prophet to be a successor. So that was Ali, who eventually, after lots of fighting to, hey, I want to be the boss, was the fourth of the great big bosses.
So full name, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. So he married Fatima and was in the running from the beginning to be Arabia's next top caliph. But as Preston mentioned, it took the first three dying, mostly violently, for Ali to finally be elected in 656. And he also didn't last very long. He only lasted 5 years to 661 CE.
Yeah. Aisha, the surviving young wife of Muhammad, was not a fan of Ali. She actively campaigned against him all of the time she could before he took over, and made it clear that she was not comfortable with him being the boss when he was.
Yeah. So Shia comes from the phrase Shia to Ali, or partisans of Ali.
The camp of Ali.
As I mentioned, Ali only lasted 5 years. He was actually assassinated, and his son Hussein and companions were also killed at the Battle of Karbala in 680. So about 20 years after his death. And this anniversary is actually still recognized as a day of mourning for Shia Muslims. So I thought this was really interesting. It's like a big holy day that's only celebrated, I was going to say half of Muslims, but we know it's about
way less than half.
20% of Muslims. Pilgrimages to Hussein's tomb are made. Passion plays are performed, and they include battles and coffins. People even flog themselves in the streets to commemorate the sacrifice.
It's actually really weird how much we see overlap in traditions of behavior between Shia Muslims and the old school Catholics.
Yeah, it is.
You got veneration of saints, you got floggings. It's just kind of
this
an interesting thing to see.
level of, and part of the reason I like religion is this level of drama that we see.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And this is an excellent example of a very dramatic group.
Very dramatic. It would take a lot for me to, I wouldn't flog myself. I would take a lot for me to flog myself. I don't know what that is. So
what it would take to get you there?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not a thing I have any interest in participating in.
I don't even like clipping a hangnail.
Sure.
No. Terrible.
Yeah, so after Ali, the Shia had a line of imams that the Sunnis didn't follow. This is where we got our big split. They counted Ali as the first imam, totally ignoring the rightly guided caliphs, as they're often called, apart from Ali. And the sixth of that line was Jafar ibn Muhammad, not the same Muhammad, we're a few generations down now. And so when Jafar died, there was another major split. Two of Jafar's sons, Ismail and Musa, each had a good handful of people who were really committed to following him. During a troubled time before Jafar's death, he had sent Ismail away just to protect him as the heir apparent, and then told everybody that he had died. That's generally agreed upon by both sides. And then a whole bunch of people are like, well, yeah, he's dead. Jafar said so. And then they never saw him again, so it was easy to believe.
Must be true. We don't have record keeping like we do now.
Well, and if somebody really wants to disappear for their own protection, it's a little harder now, but it's still possible. It was much easier back then. But some people were ready to believe and really stuck to the idea that Ismail was just in hiding and wasn't dead. And so those who insisted on the supremacy of Ismail as the oldest son were actually a really small minority out of the greater group. Because Ismail was unavailable to lead, his son took over leadership for this group who was really committed to the Ismaili line. Those that followed Musa, the living and present third son of Jafar, were the strong majority, the strong majority. And the group continued the line of imams until a 12th. And between Musa and the 11th, historically not as significant. They each had contributions. They did some cool stuff. But for the sake of brief history, they're easy enough to skip. The 11th Imam, Hassan al-Askari, was poisoned in 874 CE. And a fella named Uthman just decided, hey, everybody, there's another one. Secretly, al-Askari had a son named Muhammad.
Ooh.
And nobody could prove him wrong.
Disprove it, yeah.
But, I'm sure there were some people who didn't believe it. And they made a smaller group that doesn't seem to have stuck around. Because my guess is just conjecture. But Uthman promised that there was this son that was born a few years before Hassan al-Askari died. And there was just this idea that everybody clung to that, yeah, of course, there's this secret occultation, which is just a fancy word of he's in hiding, of this son that nobody could ever see him, but there would be deputies who would speak for him to protect him.
Ooh, cool. I like it.
Right? So Uthman said, I have a successor. And this lasted for 4 deputies until the 4th just didn't name a successor. And so we went from a lesser occultation to a greater occultation, which is still the deal today. We're still in that period of greater occultation because he's still hidden. And so the 12er Shias believe in this 12th Imam who is hiding somewhere, most say heaven, and will come back to restore Islam after it is sufficiently degraded.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Right?
Times 2. At least 2.
Yeah. This a popular tradition.
It is it is a good story. Or as my dad would say, it's a good yarn.
Sure.
Yeah. So obviously these groups are split, but there are similarities. They're not so out there doctrinally.
Most of the splits are just over leadership.
Yep.
It's actually really interesting. It's very different from what we see in Christianity in that way. I mean, a lot of it's about leadership, let's be real. But the theology isn't as widely different.
Yes, it is interesting how there isn't this same level of, and I mean, I'm not this person. This might be a better for Preston's hot take, but this like dissection of a holy book where there's so many interpretations of it and intertextuality. And, well, if you read this from the Old Testament, it influences the meaning of the New Testament. And that's where we see all these splits in Christianity. So it's actually quite impressive.
Yeah, I mean, we get a little bit of that.
Oh, absolutely,
Islam,
we do.
But yeah, not to the same degree.
No, where every time you turn around, there's a new church with a slightly different belief propping up.
Right. So we kind of followed the line on how the Shias split off and then split within themselves, kind of ignored the Sunni history from the point of the Shia split. They've largely been really good at staying a big group. There are different schools of thought, but different Sunnis from different schools of thought generally still go to the same mosque and worship together. You don't see a whole lot of Baptists going to a Catholic church.
Yes, and they're called schools of Islam. And obviously there are branches. I find them almost harder to follow.
It is actually very tricky sometimes.
And again, I don't want to like pigeonhole an entire group of people, but 2 very obviously split in doctrine and interpretation are groups like ISIS and the Taliban.
Yeah.
Right. So again, that's a extreme.
Well, and they follow
side.
a philosophy that showed up very early on in this whole history of splitting. And they were very committed basically to the idea that Muhammad is the perfect example for everything. And anybody who doesn't want to follow that example isn't worthy to live. In the most extreme cases.
Yes.
In fact, I remember a guy that I ran into when I was living in New Jersey that I don't remember how it came up. If it feels weird without context. There wasn't a lot of context when I was first told this, but he told me that it's very important for Muslim men to be sitting down because that's what Muhammad did. There wasn't a good context for him to bring this up. I don't have more context for that as far as history goes. But it's very important that they followed Muhammad's example in everything they could, which is why you see all of the full body coverings is because Muhammad's wives were told they must cover themselves. And for some people, it was like a rich people thing. Poor people didn't do that. And other people are like, no, it's just Muhammad. Don't worry about it. And other people are like, well, no, if we're going to be like Muhammad as the perfect example, our wives are going to be covered.
Yeah. So, yes, there are. And again, those are just obviously two very extreme examples of how within these two big groups, there have been more doctrinal splits and interpretation splits.
Because as history goes, you're not always going to be talking to the next community over about how you're developing your theology.
And I mean, then there's socioeconomic, political influences.
So many factors.
That's a whole different episode.
Yeah.
But bringing it back to our episode guide, similarities, lots of similarities. Like Preston said, lots are universal.
Or at least pretty close to universal.
I'm sure there's someone somewhere that will say I don't believe that. Because nothing is monolithic.
Right, exactly.
But you know what's monotheistic? Islam.
Yeah. Some of the standouts that might not fit into these similarities categories will be groups like Louis Farrakhan's Muslim revival among the African American population,
right? Which
has had an interesting path all its own.
That's its own episode. It's interesting is a kind way to put it.
Yeah.
So yes, monotheistic, and Muhammad is God's messenger. That we talked about it in our very first episode on Islam. That is said to you when you're born. That is said to you when you die. That is the declaration of faith. There is one God, and Muhammad is his messenger.
Yeah. The Shahada.
Shahada, thank you. Prayer.
Yeah.
Oh, the 5 pillars of Islam. So yes, Shahada, prayer, charitable giving, seasonal fasting, Ramadan, and the pilgrimage to Mecca.
The month of Ramadan.
Yes.
Just calling it Ramadan is strongly discouraged.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Okay. So the month of Ramadan.
Yeah.
The pilgrimage to Mecca.
Yeah.
Or the Hajj is that one. And I mention that because people will make pilgrimages all the time, but you're supposed to do the Hajj once in your life, which is a special pilgrimage during the 12th month of their lunar calendar.
Yeah. So going back to the Ramadan thing, because that's still on my mind, because that's the way my brain works. There's a really great way that was phrased that's attributed to Muhammad that explains why you don't just say Ramadan when talking about the month or the the fasting season, is because you don't say Ramadan is over or Ramadan has passed, because Ramadan is a name of God. And to say that Ramadan is gone, it counts as a great heresy.
Wow. Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Thank you for educating me.
Yeah. That's what I'm here for.
Yes.
But
for everyone.
Exactly.
Not just me.
Correct.
So we've mentioned the month of Ramadan, the performance of the Hajj. The only thing I mentioned it briefly under the 5 pillars is praying, but communal prayer.
Yeah.
Specifically.
With the group as much as possible.
As much as possible is more specific.
Yeah. Boy. Actually, I really like the way that Reza Aslan explained it in his book, No God But God.
That we read with our Patreon book club. So
Right.
if you want to join us, hop onto Patreon, join our book club. We do a book every couple months.
Yeah. So the way he explained it was that more than belief was the importance of ritual, that he really made sure the community was tight-knit by having these communal prayers, among other things.
We should do a social media post on orthopraxy versus orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So orthodoxy is the right belief, and orthopraxy is the right practice. And both Jewish people and Muslims are more orthopractic,
Pretty much, yeah.
whereas Christians tend to be more orthodoxic. It matters more what you believe than what you do, as opposed to what you do versus what you believe.
But either way, these things are just ways to separate other people and say they're not going to heaven.
Totally.
They're good.
And some of this is quite intertwined, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's
Well, what you do is connected to what you believe.
right. Like, so you can not eat pork as a Jewish person or as a Muslim person, but it'll be a lot harder to not eat pork if you don't understand the belief around why you don't eat pork, for example. That's a really rudimentary example, but it's what came to mind.
Yeah. And there's this idea of a Mahdi in both groups of Muslims. And that's about the as specific as you can get when you talk about similarities. There's a lot of varying beliefs on what this Redeemer is supposed to be. Like we talked about the Twelvers, that's a guy who was supposed to have been born and then was hidden away and will come back.
I mentioned a little later on in the notes, I mentioned that there's a group that already believes he's returned.
Mm.
So again,
lots of different beliefs.
But again, we're talking about two overarching umbrellas. So Preston, what are some of the differences? So with the split, what else happened in both practice and belief?
Well, one of the big differences, the first on my list, is the hadiths. Though all Muslims revere the Quran and are really happy to have the sayings of Muhammad that didn't make it into the Quran, the collections of hadiths are quite varied between the different groups. It doesn't matter what sort of authority a hadith claims to have, full stop. The sort of authority is not important. What matters to all Muslim communities is the social and theological value of the hadith. If a genuine saying of a prophet is incompatible with the values of the community, it will be discarded, especially if its preservation benefits a rival group. That's always going to be the case.
So then this next point of hadith being some that the Shia love and are disregarded by Sunnis, and some that the Sunnis love and are disregarded by Shias, falls right into that.
Yes, that's exactly the deal. And it's a long list. You get totally different collections in both of these groups. There's plenty of overlap, though, when it's more general, when it doesn't benefit one idea more than another, but that's what we get.
Fair. I think this next point is interesting, and I put in some thoughts, and then I'm having even more thoughts.
Okay.
So Preston made a note that hadith studies are as intense as biblical studies and maybe even more heated.
Yeah. So much argue.
And I think this is really interesting for a bunch of reasons, because the Quran and the hadiths weren't written down while Muhammad was alive.
Right.
So we get into that space of like the Gospels, where they were written, 60 to 150 years after Jesus's death. So things change. It's a bad game of telephone, secondhand information, and then people's agendas. And so we know in some cases, hadiths were just made up and said to be by Muhammad to give it this authority. But it was really just someone pushing their own agenda and said, but Muhammad said. So there's been a long history of sorting out what's true and what's not. And then.
Well, and it's never as simple as Muhammad said.
Right.
Because as much as leaning on that authority sounds great, it's not enough.
Right.
You've got to say Muhammad said to so-and-so, who said to so-and-so, who said to so-and-so.
And I was there and saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a really important thing that's kept with all of the hadiths, is this line of authoritative
almost
transmission.
I was going to say almost like a genealogy. Someone said
Almost.
to someone who said to someone.
Yeah,
And-
because it went so long without getting
Right.
written down. And so that's why it's easy to disregard a lot of things if it doesn't match what you and your group already believe. Just don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is very frustrating and leads to some really intense study.
Yep.
And they call them sciences in this field of hadith study. There's the study of who shared the saying. And there's different aspects of that too. You've got the biographical studies on the reliability of a transmitter or recorder. Just like, oh, well, if he beat his wife and lied all the time, he's no
He's
good.
probably. And his hadith says it's okay to beat your wife and lie all the time.
Yeah. And there are studies of how the saying was transmitted before being recorded on paper. That gets all kinds of funny details that people are happy to argue about. You got studies of the circumstantial context of the saying, studies of the prophet's intents in any circumstance. Like, yeah, he said this thing, but this is what's going on, so this is what he meant. Basically,
Right.
the heart of that.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that people are studying these things, and it takes up a lot of people's time. You got studies to reconcile contradictory hadiths, because if Abu says one thing, Ali says another thing, and they contradict each other, you got to figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
And did they both actually come from Muhammad? Maybe, but in different contexts. Or maybe there's a liar in the group. Maybe they're both wrong. Who knows?
Who knows?
There's arguments about preferring one over the other, and there's arguments about trying to figure out maybe the truth is somewhere in between. And of course, most of this work is built to favor the established tenets of the modern Sunni majority. There are exceptions because there's different groups, but most of the work is exactly that. Mm-hmm. And hadiths reported through Aisha are not popular with the Shia because she so strongly openly opposed Ali.
But she was pretty close to Muhammad.
She was, and counts as a very authoritative source.
authoritative. Yeah. Oh. Wives, man.
Sure.
Another difference is salat, or the Muslim prayer. So Shia Muslims will place their head on a clay tablet, soil from Karbala, where that big battle was, or some other natural material. Whereas Sunnis will use their prayer rugs, which in North America,
It's pretty common.
pretty common. Well, that's probably what you're more familiar with. Also,
But not all Muslims in Canada are Sunni.
no. No.
So you will see Muslims
No, I would
without the rugs.
say Canada probably falls along the global average of age 20,
Could be. Yeah, could be.
just with immigration
Yeah.
and just, I don't know that for sure. Don't quote me on that.
We have a pretty sizable, I don't want to say huge, but pretty sizable Ismaili population.
I
here,
feel
which
like I
think is
knew
kinda
that.
cool.
Yeah. Sunni Muslims pray 5 times a day, and they have very specific times to perform that prayer. So before dawn, early afternoon, late afternoon, after sunset, and nighttime. Many Shias, however, tend to condense some of those prayers into pairs and will only pray 3 times a day. So it's still the same 5 prayers, but they do a couple of them at the same
Together.
time.
Yeah. It's kind of nifty.
I mean, as an atheist, I'm like, well, that saves time. I like that.
Right? Generally speaking, Shia Muslims rely on what the current imam says, and the imam has the freedom to say, no, we're going to do these prayers this way from now on, until either he changes his mind or the next imam says, no, let's go back to this other way. It's very different from the Sunni practice of, we were given 5 prayers, we'll do them at 5 times.
And at these times.
Yes. So in addition to those 5 pillars that we had talked about, the 12er Shias have more, they're often called pillars. They're also called foundational professions of belief.
That sounds like a synonym for pillar.
Well, your foundation's different than the thing that holds up the roof.
Fair. And I also said synonym. I said that word wrong. I said cinnamon, not synonym. Well,
Like a champ.
it's been a long day.
So these 5 foundational professions of belief, these extra 12 pillars, monotheism, which is kind of included in the Shahada, but there's a little extra aspect to it, I guess. It's not just monotheism the way that most Christians talk about it, but it's specifically the oneness of God that a lot of people interpret as almost pantheistic or full-on panentheistic.
Kind of God is in everything, and everything is God. Yep.
Yeah, you get variety of thought in that, depending on who you talk to as well. There's also divine justice, the idea that God's judgments are always perfectly just. Very important to this faith. Then there's the prophethood of Muhammad, not just that he is the messenger of God, but that there's a really important status here. And then there's the succession after Muhammad, the Imams, very important foundational principle. And then there's the promised day of judgment and resurrection, which is pretty important to most of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. That is really, really enshrined here as a capital principle for the 12ers. And an interesting thing, we talked about the Hajj, Ismailis, that Shia minority subgroup, will also honor the pilgrimage to the Imam wherever he is. And that's actually more important than going to Mecca.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. On the topic of Imams, another big difference is that, again, the Shia believe that the Imams are descended from Ali, and they're considered near divine, infallible, sinless saints.
Which, of course, has a lot of potential problems.
Yes, we should never put any human up on that pedestal. Anyway, and then Sunnis, on the other hand, are more like your Protestant Christian, where you go to school, you're a learned interpreter of the Holy Book, and anyone can become an imam. Your
qualifications are a little bit more than who your dad is.
Yeah. Which apparently is Muhammad.
Right.
Great-great-granddaddy.
Yeah.
But wait, there's more.
There's always
more. So again, like I mentioned at the top of the episode, I didn't want this to be an oversimplification of these denominations of Islam. So just like Christianity, there have been dozens of splits over the centuries, creating different Islamic branches. There are 3 other large sects, the Adabi, Sufism, and Ahmadiyya, and dozens of other schools of thought. Mm-hmm. I threw the Kharijites in here, but I don't really know where they fit. That was your note.
They're kind of their own thing. A group that split from the main community when Ali was still around, and their ideas have made a lot of people really uncomfortable, especially more recently. They are the heritage of the fundamentalists, those text literal extremists that we see today in ISIS and the Taliban and others. Not only do they have a very strict understanding of a scriptural example as binding law, but they demand that everybody follows their example or die. It's a little rough.
Pretty extreme. Yeah. Sufism, I'm just going to touch on. We do have an episode.
We'll talk about it more later. I won't
say planned. It's in our hopper.
Yeah.
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. So Kabbalah in Judaism, Rosicrucians in Christianity, this like high mystical branch of Islam. And then the Ahmadiyya I found was really interesting. This was that group that believed the Mahdi's already come. Mm-hmm. And so Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was also a prophet that in this group that they put up with Muhammad. Muhammad was not the last prophet. We have Ahmadiyya, and he restored Islam. He lived in the early 1900s, and so they believe that he is the Mahdi that they've been waiting for. So
now Islam is the perfect way.
Perfect for them. So yeah, I just, again, super brief overview of a few other groups. I just didn't want people to be like, well, there's just 2.
Yeah, so much more complicated than that. So hopefully that inspires you to learn a little bit more. And of course, we'll be talking more about Islam in weeks to come.
Yeah, it's going to be good. And your learning doesn't have to stop at the end of this podcast.
Right.
You can check out our social media where we put out really great religious studies content.
You join our Discord where we can keep the conversation going.
A real conversation about this.
Mm-hmm.
If you like what you're hearing, you can rep us by checking our Spreadshirt and buying some sweet, sweet merch.
Patreon.
Bonus content. Book club. Early release dates. So if you're into this and you want to learn more and you want to participate more, hop onto Patreon, hop onto Discord, and show us some love.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.